So this is fun. I get to introduce Joe, which is a delight. So Joe is really one of my beloved colleagues at Type, and we've worked together for almost 20 years. He's editor-at-large of our investigative project, which is called Type Investigations, and he's also a longtime fellow at Type. If you've read the media in the last 30 years, you have read Joe Conason. He had a long-time column, I think for almost 18 years at The Observer. He wrote a column for 12 years at Salon. He is now editor-in-chief and founder of the National Memo, which is a great newsletter and you all should read. Joe has written from pretty much every publication that we have ever worked with at Type, from the American Prospect. He was at Details for a number of years, and then of course he started at the Village Voice, which is a wonderful history and tradition that we just don't have anymore in the media landscape. So he's also written for Harper's, The Nation, The New Republic, The Guardian, The New Yorker, and he has also written a number of really important books, including 2 New York Times bestsellers, The Hunting of the President, which came out in 2000, and Big Lies, The Right-Wing Propaganda Machine and How It Distorts the Truth. In my view, there's few commentators sort of alive today that can explain what is happening in our country and can detail the Republican takeover of all walks of life, and that is really Joe. And I think this book really speaks to this moment, and what's so important about it is that it gives you the historical perspective. And you have it right there, but it's called The Longest Con, and I recommend it, and it comes out 5 days from today. So it's 5 weeks from today. So it's my total pleasure to introduce Joe Conason.
Thank you, Taya. I return the love. Taya, and for that matter, the folks at Puffin, including Neil and his parents, have been supporters of mine as a fellow at Type. Before that, the Nation Institute for, as Taya said, almost 20 years. And my gratitude for that is deep, because it's made a huge difference in my work and the work of many other writers who are supported by our organization. This book I've worked on for a while, and it is going to come out on July 9th. And I wanted to tell you a little bit about why I wrote it. It wasn't for the advance, which wasn't terrible, but it wasn't that great. A few years ago, I was thinking, I had finished a book about Bill Clinton's post-presidency. It came out in 2016, and I was recovering from that for a while, and then I was like, well, I guess I should write another book. And my wife, Elizabeth, said to me, you know, I read an article in the Baffler, which you guys may not know about, but it's an interesting publication from the West Coast, kind of a lefty, snarky publication. I read an interesting article by Rick Perlstein, who's a historian. We've published him in Bold Type Books. His great book, Before the Storm, about the Goldwater movement, which led to some stuff that I wrote about in this book. He wrote a piece in the Baffler about Mitt Romney's campaign, and this is a piece from 2012, a long time ago now, that sort of examined both the mendacity of the Romney campaign against Barack Obama, but also kind of delved under that into what he discovered about a kind of underworld of right-wing grift and crookedness that was becoming more and more dominant on the American right. He had subscribed to a number of right-wing publications online, and by doing that, he suddenly found his email inbox filled with all kinds of solicitations for phony for scams, basically. Miracle cures, fake investments, penny stocks, all kinds of stuff, gold coins that were very expensive, all kinds of stuff that was being sold to a gullible audience of millions of conservatives. And as a historian, Rick Perlstein delved into this. He wrote this very funny article for the Baffler, and I said, there's more to this. And I looked at it and I said, you're right. And I decided to write a book about the culture of grift among the conservative right and how it had come to be a dominant phenomenon. And the reason I wanted to do that was Donald Trump. I've known about Donald Trump for many years. I covered him for the Village Voice. I wrote about how his company evicted a nice little old lady from her home and caused a lot of trouble for him. My colleague Wayne Barrett was one of my closest colleagues at The Voice, was really the original person who exposed Trump. And so I've been familiar with him for a long time, and I know him. I've met
Thanks
him.
a lot.
And so I thought, you know what? This culture of grifting and swindling and fraud explains a lot about the rise of Donald Trump and his ability to dominate conservatism in our time. So what Perlstein saw and what I discovered more of when I started to delve into it to write this book was an enormous overlap between these online swindlers and mail order, direct mail swindlers, if you go back in time before the online revolution in technology, and Republican and right-wing political operations. They are one in many respects. And Rick wrote a short paragraph which really kind of inspired me when I started to work this book, and I want to read it to you. He said, or I said, Rick's verdict on this was that this stuff is as important to understanding the conservative ascendancy, meaning the grifting, as are the internecine organizational and ideological struggles that make up the official history of the right, if not indeed more so. The strategic alliance of snake oil vendors and conservative true believers points up evidence of another successful long march of tactics designed to corral fleeceable multitudes all in one place, and the formation of a cast of mind that makes it hard for either them or us to discern where the ideological con ended and the money con began. And this is critical to understanding the Trump movement and Trump himself, and pretty much everyone around him, as we will get into when Dr. Schumann introduced me, because we decided we're going to talk a little bit about that, some of the other personalities. But to me, this was a flash of insight when I read those lines that said, this is how to understand a lot of what is happening now. Years after Perlstein wrote this. But he only went back so far, and I decided we had to go back further, especially because of Trump, that we would go back and look at Trump's mentor, Roy Cohn, who was a seminal figure in the corruption of the right, dating back to the 50s when, you all know, he worked for Senator McCarthy. Even before that, he played a role in sending the Rosenbergs to the electric chair, which he also did in an extremely unethical way. As it turned out, we discovered he had ex parte communications with the judge, and just not done, not supposed to be done. So this was somebody who was corrupt from the very beginning, and he'd come out of the corrupt Democratic machine in New York, which his father was part of. And this was who Trump learned from. This was who Trump, Trump has famously said, "Where's my Roy Cohn?" But in fact, Trump is his own Roy Cohn in a lot of ways, because he learned that you could dodge your taxes, lie about everything, conduct yourself with complete mendacity and irresponsibility. And Roy Cohn was only finally brought to book for all of that at the very end of his life. He had gotten away with everything for so long, and more importantly, he had been given a permission structure to do all of this by more respectable conservatives like William Safire of the New York Times, and William Buckley of the National Review, who were his friends, publicly celebrated him and didn't mind what everybody knew about him, which was that he was a corrupt crook, he was a mob lawyer, and a very, very bad person. That was okay with them, because he was on the right with them, and he was their friend. And Trump watched this after he met Roy Cohn and hired him and worked with him, and they became very, very close. He saw that you really could get away with anything. You could do pretty much anything you wanted and get away with it for almost your whole life. Now he's suddenly found out maybe you can't get away with it for your whole life, but that's a very recent development. So, you know, so when I talk about the grift of Roy Cohn, I mean, Roy Cohn represented a certain kind of grifting, which is the anti-communist grift of the 50s and 60s, which was a way of depicting communism, which I would agree was some kind of a threat to democracy. It was a problem that democratic countries faced, how to deal with communist countries and communist aggression in some places and all of that. But for them, it was a business, and it was a business of frightening people and scaring them into turning over their money in order to be educated about how to fight communism, supposedly, and all of that. And one of the things that I realized in working on this book was that what I wanted to do was to quote conservatives about other conservatives. In this book, very rarely, I think maybe not at all, do I quote liberals, Democrats, you know, the do-gooders that we're all used to, you know, like me. You know, I wanted to quote conservatives talking about conservatives. So my authority on the anti-communist grifters, who I name in the book and go into in great detail, was J. Edgar Hoover, who hated them. And the reason he hated them was because he knew they were crooks and con men, and they gave anti-communism a bad name. They would claim to have connections to him and to the FBI, and when they didn't, or they would exaggerate them. And I uncovered a lot of internal memos from Hoover and other officials of the FBI about these anti-communist crusaders, Billy James Hargis and others who you might or might not be familiar with, but they're all interesting characters. And Hoover excoriated them and investigated them, actually, and found out some pretty terrible stuff about them. But what it showed was that there was a big audience of people who could be conned, who could be tricked into giving up significant amounts of money in order to combat a frightening threat like communism, or later gay rights, or later the women's movement, or later, you know, you pick your boogeyman, your scary phenomenon, and the civil rights movement for a while. I mean, this is all, it's a template of deception that has been incredibly profitable for a certain number of people. And another of the people I talk about in this book is Richard Viguerie, who you may or may not have ever heard of, but he's a really important guy who founded the sort of the methodology for reaching these conservatives, because he realized that the Goldwater campaign had amassed a list of names of conservatives that had never existed before. And he sent people to, women mostly, who he could hire for low wages, to the Capitol to go to the clerk of the House office, where in those days you had lists of people who had donated to presidential campaigns, to copy the names of all the Goldwater donors across the country. And he suddenly had this list of millions of names that they put on computer tapes so they could send them direct mail all the time. And it was a gold mine. And he rented it out to various, you know, organizations on the right. He was very right-wing himself. One of the things about this is that the reason that this is so appealing to the right is because the right, in general, hates regulation. And regulation is what protects ordinary people from frauds of different kinds, especially frauds in the mail, frauds online, At least it's supposed to. You complain to the Attorney General if you want. The right is against that. They don't want any regulation, so especially not of their own grifting scams. So there was a natural symbiosis between the far right and these crooked con men. And what happened over time was that what had started out as this sort of anti-communism scam would eventually morph into different versions of itself. So you had something that was called the New Right, which was led by people like Roger Stone, who you have heard of, probably Trump's longtime consigliere. Grifting constantly through direct mail. I mean, I go into in the book the minuscule amounts that they would spend on the campaigns that they were supposedly supporting, either political campaigns or ideological campaigns, and keep the money for themselves. And they became millionaires from the fact that people were willing to send in money because you could get them riled up. Roger's motto was hate always wins. And if you excited people's anger and hate, you could get them to put a check in the mail to you. And they were incredibly successful. And this eventually morphed into other versions of basically the same thing. Moral majority, which prospered on fear about, at that time, gay rights, a lot of it. It began as a movement, a pro-segregation movement in the South, actually, which I expose in the book. They like to say that they were upset about abortion, but that wasn't it. It was really about keeping their segregation academies going when the Carter administration was trying to shut them down. And again, the fear, the hatred was always incredibly profitable. And it kept morphing into different versions. So, you would eventually have Sarah Palin and the Tea Party. And you would have the birther movement, which was also an incredible scam online that they made a lot of money from, that Trump became the symbol of. And now we have the MAGA movement, which there was nobody more suited to become the Il Duce of conservative grifting than Donald Trump. He had been a grifter his whole life. And I go into a lot of the grifts, he was the product of a mythology that was created both in the first book that he supposedly wrote, which he didn't write, which Tony Schwartz wrote and now regrets having done very much, which promoted him as a brilliant businessman. It was all falsehoods. And then The Apprentice on television, which really created him as a national figure, which was, again, completely fraudulent. And I talk about this in great detail in the book, what kind of a guy he really was, which was not successful. He was entirely, a silver spoon baby who squandered his father's inheritance and would have a lot more money if he just put it in bonds, when he got the money from his dad. So it's all fakery. And he has turned this into a high art. I go through all the cons that he was involved in before he ran for office. Trump University, which, again, you see the permission structure of the far right, where when Trump was just a candidate for president and hadn't won yet, publications like the National Review, very conservative, the founding publication of American conservatism, attacked him over Trump University, exposed it as an outrageous scam, the kind of thing that would have normally ended the political career of anybody, because he had swindled thousands of people out of money with a phony university and fake courses that were supposed to make them rich. And the National Review published several pieces about this. Now, they're with him. They defend him. And this is true across the board on the right, because over the years, the right has become so hollowed out by its own complicity in these scams and cons the honest conservatives, who are a remnant, really, now called never-Trumpers, but that's a synonym for honest conservatives. These are the people who would not go along with these scams, and there is no content left in conservatism anymore, and certainly not in the Republican Party. They don't have a platform anymore. I don't know if you noticed that. They actually stopped bothering to have a platform. Why? Because the platform was whatever Trump tells them to do, and whatever Trump tells them to do, a lot of it has to do with grifting. The, Stop the Steal movement is an enormous grift. He's made $250 million from that over the last couple of years. That is what is going on, and a lot of their desire to be in the White House has to be with the fact that it is a way to make a lot of money. His son-in-law booked $2 billion, and they've all done this. I've examined a lot of this in the book. So, what do the conservatives do? I mean, they're the actual conservatives. What can they do? My friend George Conway, who you may have heard of or seen on TV, wrote the foreword to this book, and they're in a state of despair over this. I mean, their party is gone. They don't have, their movement has been completely corrupted. It's not that they don't believe in conservative principles anymore. A lot of them do, although I think they're questioning some of that as well, because they see how easily it was corrupted over the years and turned into really nothing. It's kind of evaporated as an ideology or a philosophy. But I wanted to read you one more thing, because even the very, very right-wing people, I don't know if you've ever heard of Eric Erickson, but he runs a site called Red State. He's a super right-wing guy, gun nut, he's anti-abortion, all of it. And Eric Erickson is one of a number of conservatives who've written about the fact that their movement has been corrupted so badly. He quit the National Rifle Association because it too is a corrupt, grifting scam. And he said, last year he wrote, "I've seen senior members of the conservative movement decide it was time to cash in and grift out. I've seen young hucksters wrap the label of conservatism around themselves and prey on retirees for cash, showing fabricated results in return." A very good example of this is a guy named Charlie Kirk, you may have heard of, who was very close to Trump. He runs something called TPUSA, Turning Point USA, which is the youth wing of the Trump movement. He's become a millionaire in a few years through the grift of TPUSA. Erickson said, "I'm so old, I remember when CPAC, the Conservative Political Action Committee, was a gathering of actual conservatives and not a grift operation with a gay cruising scene on the side, because Matt Schlapp, the head of it, was sued for gay sexual harassment." So he's angry. He's angry to see his movement corrupted, but there's not much he can do about it, because under Trump, they have not only a grift and a con game, but a fascist-oriented dictatorship within their own movement. You are not allowed to dissent. You are not allowed to disagree with Trump at all, and you're certainly not allowed to point out that he's grifting off of your own people. But that's what they do, and my own view, and we'll talk about this with Dr. Schumann, but my own view is that until I personally think it would be good to have an honest conservative movement in our country. It's not bad to have two sides of the argument. Democrats untrammeled and without any critics are probably not going to always do the right thing, or even liberals, but that can't exist until the dishonesty and mendacity are defeated. And so when you ask these conservatives what they think, what will come, how will they retrieve what was once, at least a respectable philosophy and outlook and part of American life, they know nothing can change until Trump is defeated and driven out. So that's it. I hope you'll read the book. I think you'll find that it's both sad and funny, but interesting. And I appreciate your coming today very much.
You've talked, I guess, sufficiently about Roy Cohn. Okay, we won't talk any further.
Well, there's a lot more about him in the book.
Well, we can say a lot more about Roy Cohn. Well, let's talk a little bit about Roy Cohn in terms of his crooked side. I want to ask you one other question. He was also a lawyer to RFK, not junior but senior. RFK figures in your book a little bit towards the end. What was his relationship to RFK?
No, they didn't get along. RFK, Senator Robert Kennedy, who had been the Attorney General under his brother's presidency, for a while served on Senator McCarthy's staff also. And he and Roy did not get along. They clashed on the staff. And RFK worked for McCarthy. I think it was always something that he had trouble explaining why he did that. McCarthy was a friend of his dad. And, so that was one of his first jobs. But he did not get along with Roy. And then later, when he was Attorney General, the Justice Department in New York was investigating Roy because he was already involved in a lot of crooked dealings, bad stock deals and other scams. And the U.S. Attorney in New York at the time, Robert Morgenthau, who I knew, was investigating him and indicted him 3 times while Bobby Kennedy was the Attorney General. So Roy blamed Robert Kennedy for that, as well as Morgenthau. And he was, by the way, he was not convicted in any of those cases, which he was very proud of. Right. So he got away with it at that point. But I was going to say, one of the reasons that I wrote this book this way is that I'm an investigative reporter. I'm an investigative journalist. I'm not an ideological writer or a philosopher. I started working at the Village Voice, and even before that, as an investigative reporter, and reporting on, Democratic corruption in New York as well as Republicans. There weren't many Republicans, and so that's my orientation. I've been looking at con men and crooks for a long time.
You certainly hit a gold mine with this.
Yes.
Absolutely. I want to talk a little bit more about professional anti-communists. It seems as if these grifters and swindlers, through a period starting in the 50s up until the current moment, have been able to hitch their corruption and their chicanery and their criminality onto various movements, ideologies, and so on and so forth, and as we move through time, right? And the first one is anti-communism, as you point out. Can you talk a little bit more? You mentioned Billie Jane Hargis, James Hargis. Can you talk a little bit more about those professional, what J. Edgar Hoover, and I hate to say something positive about J. Edgar Hoover, but everything is relative, I guess. But in effect, whom he referred to as...
He didn't like them horning in on his business.
Yes, that's right.
Looking at it.
But you can refer to as professional or referred to as professional.
Yes, well, that's what he called them.
Yes.
And he considered them sort of amateurs, and they didn't really know anything. And he had a point there. But so there was Dr. Fred Schwartz, who was a physician from Australia, who started the Christian anti-communism crusade. And there were various imitators of his, a guy named Fred Smoot, and Dan Smoot, and a variety of them who would go into this business. And what they would do is they would travel around and lecture circuit. They would sell tapes and books and pamphlets and all kinds of stuff at grossly inflated prices. And it was all, designed around an idea that communism was about to triumph around the world, and that it was going to basically kill half the population of the world for being bourgeois, and so on. I mean, it was, the communists, in China and in Russia and the Soviet Union were bad enough without being anything like the crazy mythology that was being constructed around them by these grifters. And Hoover resented that because they were making him look foolish. I mean, it was because they were citing him. They would pretend that they knew him, that they worked with him, and got very exercised about this. And a lot of it involved also smearing of respectable people and organizations as communist, all the way from, General Marshall, who, created the Marshall Plan that probably saved Europe from communism, which McCarthy participated in as well, down to, your local, Protestant congregations, which they would say were dominated by communists, simply because of something like support for civil rights, or, because in addition to everything else, these movements were very racist, in some cases anti-Semitic, and, the furthest far right that you could kind of get in American society.
Yeah, well, the Soviet Union is gone, but those smears still have some resonance with Donald Trump, right? Liberals and Democrats are socialists and communists,
right,
and so on and so forth.
Yeah. No, they reflexively go back to that.
Right. Well, going back to it, let me just say, and it really boggles my mind in terms of the grip that conspiracy theories seem to have on the mentality of tens of millions of Americans who seem to have lost their minds. And yet, as you point out, there's a tradition of conspiracy theories as well, and you spend some ink talking about the John Birch Society.
Yes.
And tell us about the John Birch Society.
Well, the John Birch Society was among the original conspiracy mongers in this country, because they believed that the worldwide communist conspiracy had been so successful that it had compromised figures up to and including General Eisenhower, later President Eisenhower, as a conscious agent of the communist conspiracy. And this was so outrageous that, and many, many other people, this was so outrageous that even Bill Buckley had to try to distance himself from it. But the Birch Society was quite influential for a long time, and would hold rallies, and they were not as much of a grift. I mean, they had a real organization. Robert Welch was been a candy manufacturer and had his own personal fortune, so he wasn't really in it for the money. But the Birch Society supported these other grifters in different ways, and they worked together and promoted the same idea of a conspiracy that reached into all facets of American life. And organizations or movements now like QAnon are kind of modeled on that paranoid idea that, at the top of society, the elites are manipulating our lives and for nefarious ends. And this was the same idea, and it's appealed to conservatives for a long time. It's, by the way, the same idea that motivated Hitler. If you look at what Hitler wrote about Jews, a lot of it was paranoid conspiracy ideology, protocols of the Elders of Zion, and all of that. So this is a pattern on the right and the far right that has been persistent for 100 years.
Well, you can take it, it's a different discourse, but, it's absolutely frightening, because if you can believe these conspiracy theories, you can believe anything.
Yeah.
And, there's no check on questions of truth, facticity, reality, and so on and so on.
No, and when they make predictions about what's going to happen, and it doesn't happen, it doesn't matter. The followers, believe, well, the next prediction will be true, or there's some explanation for it. And the grifters, meanwhile, know, and QAnon is also a huge grift, that they can, the people who want to believe this stuff are going to believe it, and it's very hard to shake them.
And open up their checkbooks, too.
And open up their checkbooks.
Right. Yeah, you talk about, you did mention it in your presentation about Barry Goldwater. He himself was not a grifter, but again, how should I say it, the ascendance of the conservative, and I would say even ultra-conservative movement in the personage of Barry Goldwater and his campaign sort of, again, created fertile ground for these grifters around him. And I was wondering if you could dwell about that. And then later again with Reagan, you see a recapitulation of a similar dynamic.
Yeah, I mean, Barry Goldwater was a very interesting figure because he was kind of an upright guy. I mean, he was not a crook. He was from a wealthy family. He, I think, believed in conservative principles. He was quite extreme. He believed some crazy things. but, you know, he believed we should use nuclear weapons in Southeast Asia. I mean, he believed some very dangerous things. But he was not a crook or a con man in that way. And eventually, he distanced himself from all this. You know, later in his life, he basically turned on the far right and said that they were a disgrace, and they had shamed him in a lot of ways. But his movement and the sort of the paranoia inherent in the movement created a fertile ground for exploiters like Viggory, who I mentioned before, who took the Goldwater list and found that these were people indeed who could be treated like sheep and sheared repeatedly, and he was not the only one. Goldwater was supported by all the anti-communist grifters that I talked about before. They all saw in Goldwater's campaign a big opportunity to bring people together who would be, as Pearlstein said in the quote that I read, you would gather them together and exploit them.
Right.
And that has been going on, now, to the point where there are millions of people on the Trump lists who they are able to get to give money to a guy who claims to be a billionaire to pay his legal fees, okay, for crimes that he's committed, to defend against crimes that he's allegedly committed and, in my view, has committed. They send the money over and over again.
Right. Well, Richard Nixon, as we recall, famously said, quote, "I'm not a crook," right? At least he had enough conscience to be ashamed of being assumed to be a crook, right?
Yes.
That conscience seems to have disappeared in terms of the figures who
That was a different
But there was
time.
a lot of crookery and conniving and drifting and theft that were going on around him. Again, these conservatives seem to attract a type of
Yes, I go through that in the
bad
book.
actors.
Yeah, in the book I look at the Nixon administration, Reagan administration. The Reagan administration was, until Trump, by far the most corrupt in American history, just in terms of the number of people indicted for various crimes who were in that administration. This is not an ideological judgment on them. These kinds of analyses have been done by criminologists, who I quote in the book, who were looking at white-collar crime as a social phenomenon and trying to do some social science around that, and discovered, hey, there's really a lot of criminality here. And coming out of that, coming into the Reagan administration, and then coming out of it, were people like Roger Stone, who was one of the founders of the National Conservative Political Action Committee, which was, again, a big grifting operation, but that prospered enormously from the advent of Reaganism.
Roger Stone has deep roots, goes far back, doesn't he?
He does.
Right.
He does. He goes back to the Nixon years. He has a tattoo of Nixon on his back, quite infamously. I know Roger. I mean, I know a bunch of these people as a reporter. I knew Roy Cohn as well. They're quite remorseless. So Roger, was introduced into the Reagan campaign by Roy Cohn. He is another product of Roy Cohn, and then it was Roger who takes credit for the idea that Trump should run for president, and helped to make that a reality.
Well, let me ask you, it's not in your book, and it's sort of a bit indirect in terms of your thesis, but it's a golden opportunity. I don't want to pass this up. This type of behavior is foreign to me, and one reason is I had a mother who was ethical and endowed me with a conscience, and I like to believe I'm an honest guy. So this type of behavior is totally foreign to the way in which I think, and hopefully the way in which I would ever behave. You've met these guys, right? Tell me about them. Give us a psychological assessment. Do these people have a conscience? Do they have second thoughts? Do they ever ask themselves, what would my mother say if I behaved like this? I mean, I'm asking a serious question. Because ultimately, all these decisions and the fabric of society comes down to the characters and virtues of the citizenry, of individual citizens. Either they have a conscience and morals and ethics, or they don't. And I'm curious about what your impression was of these people if you went out to dinner with them or had a beer with them. What types of people are these? This is not in your book, I
So,
realize
yeah,
that.
no,
but I can't ask you.
so, Joe, I think you know that everybody has a mother, but not all mothers are good mothers. And,
Well, this is true.
Roy Cohn famously had a mother who could see no wrong in anything he did.
Okay.
Dora Marcus Cohn was his mother and came from a wealthy family, and he actually went back and lived with his mother in New York for a while after he came back from Washington. And, you know, basically his parents, you know, aided and abetted him in everything he did, and I think the same is largely true of Trump. If you read Mary Trump's books, then you know what the Trump family was like and how Donald was basically, you know, taught by his dad to be as ruthless and conniving as he turned out to be. So, you know, they can be very charming. I've spent time with Trump. I've spent a little time with Roy Cohn. I know Roger Stone better than either of them. I spent a good amount of time with Roger over the years, and they're intelligent and capable. Trump seems less intelligent to me now, but certainly Roger and Roy were very smart. They were not incapable of charm, but I think they were also not very big on introspection. They were not, you know, looking inside and you know, assessing their own motives and behavior. They didn't really care. They had appetites and desire for power and felt justified in their immoral behavior.
It's important to know. Thanks. I know it's a little off topic, but I just couldn't.
It's a reasonable question.
Yeah. Okay. One of the outfits you mentioned is a consulting firm, I guess a lobby, made up of Charles Black, again, Roger Stone, Paul Manafort, who has deep roots here,
Yes.
been around a long time, and a guy by the name of Peter Kelly, who was actually a Democrat, and they were known by their initials, BMSK. And what upset me, you know, I taught human rights for 20 years at Columbia, and I've been a human rights advocate, so this caught my attention, because I recall the horrendous civil war in El Salvador, where the Reagan administration was arming to the teeth a succession of horrible dictators that employed torture and so forth. We basically helped to perpetuate genocide in Guatemala, right, and among the natives. So this was a horrible period from the point of view of the abuse of human rights, and yet, from what I can tell, what I infer from your discussion of these lobbyists, this consulting firm, is that they took huge amounts of money. They were probably approached by these generals and offered a huge amount of money to lobby for more military assistance in arms. That's a horrible thing. And
Yes.
I'm wondering, I mean, when you talk about immorality, that is probably as bad as it gets. And I'm wondering if you can talk about this crew, this so-called consulting firm, that were agents of death.
A lot of this, and it relates to the anti-communism discussion as well.
Yes, that's
the
right.
justification for quite a bit of this was anti-communism. So in the Philippines, for instance, where I did some journalism, I reported from there, I helped expose corruption there, they represented the government of Ferdinand Marcos, Roger Stone, Paul Manafort, and the rest of them, and got the U.S. to give huge amounts of money to the Marcos regime, because supposedly if we didn't, China was going to, you know, sponsor a communist revolution there, and that would be, you know, the end of our democratic ally, except he wasn't democratic, he was a dictator. And what happened was the money that our government sent to Marcos, he stole a lot of it himself and recycled a share of it to people like Roger Stone to lobby for him in Washington and make sure he kept getting the money. This was a pattern that was repeated over and over again. It was repeated in Zaire with Mobutu. It was repeated in, you know, Indonesia and, you know, all over the place. That these right-wing authoritarian governments were taking the money and recycling it into American politics on the right-wing side in order to support them. You know, when Marcos finally was forced to leave the Philippines, he was famously reported to have said to Paul Laxalt, the senator who was very close to Reagan, who talked to Marcos about
Yes.
getting out. Marcos said, "I can't believe Reagan's doing this to me. I gave him $5 million." And he had not given $5 million to Reagan personally, but apparently he had given or somehow sent millions of dollars into what he thought was the Reagan campaign. And apparently this was skimmed off possibly by Paul Manafort and others in that firm.
So they really made themselves very rich peddling death.
They did.
Yes.
They did, and they spent a lot of it. I mean, Manafort famously spent vast amounts of money on houses and clothes and all kinds of stuff.
Well, we mentioned Roger Cohen several times, and he's still on the scene. Can you just briefly give us a timeline of his career?
You mean Roger Stone?
Roger Stone, I'm sorry, yes.
Yeah, so Roger started out in the Nixon campaign as a dirty trickster. He was sort of on the scene, playing dirty tricks on Democrats and other Republicans back when Nixon was running for re-election in 1972. This was the Watergate period, and Roger was quite young at the time. He was probably 19 or 20 years old, working in the Young Republicans, and he got a long look by the Watergate prosecutors, but they in the end did not have a case on him. He took over the Young Republicans at one point with a group of others, including Karl Rove. He then joined the consulting firm, became a political consultant, and was quite successful. Started NCPAC, the National Conservative Political Action Committee, which I mentioned before, and really prospered during the Reagan era. And it's this culture of grifting was so powerful that Roger's first wife, a woman named Ann Stone, actually she worked for Viggory as well, and she learned a lot of the tricks of the trade from observing that, and she started a Republicans for Choice PAC, which collected a lot of money from women who wanted the Republican Party not to be anti-choice, but to be pro-choice, and then basically spent all the money on herself. And she did this for years, cycle after cycle. She'd send out the mailings, and Republican women would send in the money, and it was millions of dollars. And she had learned this from Roger and continued to practice this scam for years and years and years. So this is like, it's amazing how almost contagious it was among a certain kind of conservative.
Right. Okay, we talked about anti-communism as a phenomenon to which these scammers have hooked their wagons. Another mainstay, which interests me tremendously, I got my doctorate in religion at Columbia, so I've always been interested in religion and how it intersects with society politically. The next great movement, I guess, to which scammers found a very comfortable environment was evangelical Christianity. And I just want to mention one of my previous guests here at Puffin was a friend of mine, Randall Balmer, who was a historian, one of the foremost historians of evangelical.
Great historian.
He's a great guy, evangelical movement. He himself was born as an evangelical, a left wing. There has been historically a left component to evangelical Christianity, and he feels very betrayed by his movement. And he says in one of his more recent books that I interviewed him on, that evangelical Christianity in the United States is no longer a religious movement. It's lost its soul. It basically has become a political extremist movement. And he's probably the foremost.
Right about that.
What?
I think he's right about that.
Yeah, I mean, he's one of the foremost historians of evangelical Christianity here. I'd like you to talk about that. I mean, certainly, I remember well, he was very active politically during the Bush administration in terms of trying to combat the excesses of Jerry Falwell's moral majority that brought evangelicals into the political arena after 50 years, since the Scopes trial, 50 years of being politically quiescent. And then you had Pat Robertson, who was really a businessman, right, and a corrupt one, and the Christian Coalition. These people controlled Congress in many ways. I mean, they had a lot of congressmen in their pockets at the time, but they were also very corrupt enterprises. Talk to us about this and about Jerry Falwell Falwell Jr., and you make no bones about it, whereas the father may have had some claim to religiosity, the son did not. He was just
not much,
an entrepreneur, and turned out with the pool boy scandal and so on and so
Yes,
forth
no, he was
to be immoral in the conventional sense.
So,
Yes.
what's interesting about this is sort of the overlap of the political and the religious that I examine in the book, which goes back to the origins of the moral majority, which were not in religion or morality or even the desire to have a political influence. It was Richard Viguerie, who I mentioned earlier as the sort of impresario of all of this, realized that evangelical Christians were angry over the attempts to close down segregated schools. Viguerie was pretty much of a segregationist himself. He had worked for George Wallace's campaign. And he went to Jerry Falwell, who was a rising evangelical minister with a noted right-wing ideology. He had attacked Martin Luther King publicly and said, you know what? We could make a lot of money doing this. We could make a lot of money if we could enroll evangelical Christians in a political movement. And Falwell was at first scoffed at this. So Viguerie actually went and they did a poll to prove to Falwell that this could succeed. And Falwell signed up with it, and that was how the moral majority actually started, which was as basically a business deal with an entrepreneur, Viguerie. And it grew from there. And I go into great detail about Falwell's financial shenanigans and how he eventually built Liberty University. But this began with a lie. Falwell decided that he needed a list. He needed lists as well. And he went to a famous evangelical publisher who was not political at all and didn't believe that evangelicals should be involved in politics, and persuaded him that this gentleman should give him a huge list of evangelical pastors and ministers, because they were going to use it to build a great evangelical university, not to build a political movement. And when they got that list, Falwell turned to his buddy who had gone with him to trick this elderly gentleman into giving them this list, and said, I feel like we just raided Fort Knox. Because they realized that we can make a ton of money. And they did. Eventually he squandered a lot of it. I mean, there's all kinds of hills and valleys in the Falwell financial saga leading up to Liberty University, which is an incredibly successful business. It's nominally an educational institution, I would say, but it is really a huge online business. And his son, Jerry Jr., whose scandals you mentioned, who was very close to Trump and helped Trump to get to where he is in the beginning, because Trump needed the cover of religious leaders because of his own very, gamey past. Jerry Jr. never was religious at all.
Right.
And he started out as the kid who would go with his dad to these events where Jerry Sr. was speaking and collect money from people and sell them stuff. And that was his whole orientation. It was all about business for him.
Yeah, I think there's a very important nexus here that we have to underscore, and that is Trump's largest constituency when he was elected was the evangelical Christian movement. Without them, he would not have been elected, I think. And the connection that your book makes, which I think is very important, is that the way in that created, or the conduit that created the alliance between evangelicals and Donald Trump was indeed this hucksterism. In other words, the evangelicals had become so besotted with fraud that there was a type of common cause and common interest. They were kissing cousins already, right. That is Trump and the evangelicals.
So there came a point where nobody would any longer be surprised when a new scandal erupted among evangelical Christians.
Right.
Jimmy Swagger, Jim and Tammy Faye Baker, one after another, you would see this criminality among evangelicals and their enormous capacity to swindle their followers. And then there was an even more extreme version of that called the prosperity gospel. And this
is still around.
It was very much around. And in fact, Trump's own pastor, the one he calls his pastor, is a prosperity gospel preacher named Paula White, who is infamous crook, and naturally. And so, back in the day, Jerry Falwell Sr. denounced the prosperity gospel, which is basically a philosophy that if you believe in God enough and you give enough to the prosperity gospel preacher, if you tithe enough, if you turn over enough of your money to them, you will in turn prosper, and you'll be healthy, and you'll be wealthy. And it's a superstition that they use to prey on people to get them to cough up big amounts of money from relatively poor people, and it's an outrage, and it's honest religious people consider it a blasphemy, among other things, including at one point even Falwell himself denounced it as a blasphemy and said that he had to take over Jim and Tammy Faye Baker's business when they were disgraced because God had told him to put an end to the prosperity gospel. But flash forward, and really he was just trying to take over their business for his own wealth, and his son and Trump and Paula White and all of them are now completely in the prosperity gospel mold, and that is what evangelical Christianity has largely become today.
Yes. What would Jesus say?
What's that?
What would Jesus say?
What would Jesus say?
Right. Okay.
Well, I'm pretty sure Jesus would not approve of any of this, but what
do
I know? I'm Jewish, and it is astonishing.
It really, the perversion of it is
Yeah.
just absolutely. We're talking about tens of millions of Americans.
Yes.
This is not a small constituency.
Yes.
Yeah, I just want to read from your book that makes this clear, because I think this point is so important in terms of the political and irrational environment and criminal environment that we're in. You say, well, seasoned political observers were initially puzzled by the evangelical backing that helped Trump clinch the Republican nomination and win the presidency by a whisker in November 2016. Their alliance makes a twisted kind of sense in retrospect. It's easier to understand now why Trump gained that crucial support and why a certain group of evangelical and Pentecostal leaders so swiftly lined up behind him. To put it bluntly, the religious leaders most inclined towards grift and greed, not unlike Trump himself, you say in parentheses, were also the most eager to join his campaign and to invent a variety of excuses for an irreligious, profane, and brazenly immoral politician. That cohort was led not only by Jerry Falwell Jr., but by the same shifty Word of Faith anglers, that was not a movement, whose prosperity gospel had been denounced thunderously as heretical by Falwell's own father. Very well said. You also claim the prosperity gospel is preposterous.
Well, yes.
At least that. Right?
Yes.
Right.
I mean, it doesn't work out for most people.
No, it doesn't work out for most people, except for the.
It works out for the preachers.
It is for the
It's good
preachers.
for them.
Yes. But the evangelical movement has long had. This was burlesqued in the 19th century. It has long had its hucksters and snake oil salesmen and so on.
Absolutely.
It's sort of ripe for that type of.
But the problem, Joe, is that now, they used to do it from the back of a wagon or something.
Right.
They'd get a few suckers to come around. Now, they can reach millions of people, instantly.
That's right.
And that it makes it into a huge social problem, in my
Right.
opinion.
Yeah, talk to us a little bit about the Tea Party movement as laying the groundwork for Donald Trump and this type of grift.
Well, the Tea Party movement, there were various aspects of the Tea Party movement, one of which was its innate racism, which was profound. It was a reaction to the election of Barack Obama in many ways. And it was always a racist thing. That was what the birther movement was about. But it also was, as I go into in some detail in the book, a huge grift. I mean, it was, they set up organizations that were direct mailing people and emailing people and collecting money from them and promising that they were going to overthrow Obama and get rid of him and take over Congress and all the rest, and really taking a lot of the money for themselves. And Trump, for a while, Sarah Palin was going to be the avatar of this movement. She was and she also pulled in a ton of money from the Tea Party followers herself personally. She made millions of dollars. But in the end, could not withstand, I think, the pressure of a presidential campaign and decided on Trump. They were very disappointed with that. But it left an opening for Trump and Roger Stone.
Yeah. Let me step back. I have to bring this to an end, and I want to open it up to questions from our guests. This is a different type of question. I ask myself this very, very frequently. In order for there to be fraud, there has to be the person who delivers the fraud, but also a population that's willing to be duped. How do you explain where the American public is these days, that so many millions of people are willing to believe things and notions that are so contrary to reality, to truth, to the rules of evidence? What's happened to us that we have produced so many dupes that are willing to be fooled and defrauded and even open up their checkbooks to basically support this fraud? How do you look at it in a broader context?
I don't know that I have a great answer to that. I mean, I guess the theme of the book is that this is a population that has been sort of trained to do this over a long period of time. That, as I said before, Trump didn't just arrive out of nowhere one day. This has been, cultivated on the right for a long, long time. And there has been very little, as much as my friends like Conway and others who I've gotten to know on the right, who are appalled by all of this, there has been very little leadership on the right against any of this. I mean, even, someone like Mitt Romney, who was, in some ways the inspiration for this book because of the piece that Rick wrote about his 2012 campaign. Now Mitt Romney denounces all this. Now Mitt Romney is very upset about this. If you go back to the 2012 campaign, he was participating in it. He was helping to spread this. And the problem is that conservative politicians for many years have aided and abetted this, going all the way back to McCarthy, but since then, in many, many ways and occasionally. When you look at Congress today, there's no voice against Trump on the party. They accept all of this. They go along with every bit of it and defend it. And so, there are not role models, really. If you have a conservative impulse, or you are worried about, change, too much change too fast, which is not an abnormal thing for people to be concerned about. What you're going to get in terms of thought leadership, really, is conspiracies, is cons, is grifts. It's not, and so they've been trained over many years to fall for this stuff.
Yeah, well,
that's the best explanation I have.
I know, but there's a lot. It still boggles my mind.
There could be something in the water.
I don't know why tens of millions of Americans have lost their minds. I mean, it really is a very frightening. It's a very frightening reality.
It is.
Which brings me to the end.
I try to make it funny.
Some of it is very funny. And you have to laugh, I guess, sometimes because it seems so dreadful. I mean, when I look ahead, and I suspect there are many in the audience who share my disposition, I'm filled with both a sense of dread and ambiguity about the future. I walk around with a sense of dread. I don't know what this country is going to look like after November. If Biden wins, maybe we have a chance to begin to set the ship up right again. Not that Trumpism is going to automatically disappear. If Trump wins, I think we're headed for very dark, dismal, difficult times. He clearly has fascist propensities. He's an authoritarian. He's already told us what he's going to do. It's awful. Okay. Now, the question I have is basically turning to you. What do you see in terms of what lies ahead? Can you take out your crystal ball?
You're not going to get me to disagree with anything you just said.
Well, that's too bad.
So I wish I could. I mean,
do you see things, let's put it this way, a little more favorably. There's a cancer afoot in American society. Okay, do you see any forces that move in the opposite direction?
Listen, I would say a majority of Americans don't want this stuff.
Okay.
That's pretty
important
clear.
to remember.
The problem, we have problems in our system that prevent a majority from expressing its will correctly and properly and with sufficient force. But it's still nevertheless true that most Americans don't agree with any of this stuff and don't want this and know that it's bullshit and, you know, would like to see a different future for the country. And I still think there's a very good chance that they'll win in the fall, that Democratic candidates will win across the board. And I know, you know, I'm sure the Puffin Foundation doesn't want me to speak in a partisan way, so I'm going to issue this disclaimer. You still should vote however you see fit, but in fact, you know, they have to be defeated in order for us to get out of this in any way.
Well, I don't think you have to apologize. I'm very strict about not being partisan in certain environments, but there's a category shift here. Donald Trump doesn't represent partisan policies. He represents the destruction of our very constitutional order, which gives me permission to basically rail against him in whatever environment it may be.
I give you permission too.
Well, thank you very much. Okay, and again, let me put in a promotion for this book, The Longest Con. It's coming out shortly. I strongly encourage you to get this book, buy it, read it, enjoy it, share it with your friends. It's not only engaging, it's an extremely important read that helps elucidate where we are and how we've gotten to this place. Okay, we have some time for some questions. Yes, in the back there.
So how does it work when you've collected money for a specific purpose and then the money doesn't get used for that purpose? I mean, we just saw the 34 counts where somebody was using the money to pay off somebody and they paid consequences. How do all these people seemingly do this con you're speaking of year after year with no accountability for the money ever being used for the purpose that it was supposed to be used for, whether it's campaign or whatever it is they said they would do? How do they do this?
So there are two reasons for that. Okay, one is that we have a very lax enforcement of any kind of regulation of these political committees or any charitable organizations. I mean, you know, the attorneys general of the states are supposed to enforce regulations around charities and nonprofits, and we have other entities, you know, on the federal and state level that are supposed to enforce some regulation of the spending of political money. But in fact, it's almost entirely unregulated. Rarely do you see someone prosecuted for misusing money. And certainly back when, you know, the period that I'm talking about in the book, nothing. Now, Trump stealing all this money for the Stop the Steal, they were supposedly looking at a prosecution of that, but he was not indicted for that, and I don't think he will be. But the answer is very, very lax enforcement. And the other problem that I think exists is that on the right, the right-wing journalism is incredibly lax in exposing it. You know, if you're a Republican donor, like a small donor, and you read in the National Review or Human Events or any of these right-wing publications that your money was being misused, as the reporters there could certainly find out for you, then you might stop giving, and there might be some, stricture against that kind of behavior. But in fact, all of these right-wing publications make money themselves off of this. They are advertising with these people. They are It's all part of one game, one system. And so the people who are the victims of these cons never find out, unless they read my book. But I don't know if they will, but yes.
It might be off the topic, but the Koch family, the very wealthy Koch.
Koch family.
Koch
Oh,
family.
yes.
I think they, where are they lately? Because they have so much tremendous money and so much tremendous power. I think they weren't supporting Trump after a while, but do you know anything about where they will be at? Or I haven't heard where they're directing their pretty heavy duty power.
I've sort of lost track of that in this cycle, what the Koch family is doing. I mean, it's worth looking at that again. They've been up and down with Trump, it's true. But even they are not able to, redirect the Republican Party away from Trump, as much as they might want to do that. And the fact is, they are still supportive of all the other Republicans who rally around Trump. So it kind of doesn't make any difference. Trump is a supporter of policies that create profit for the Koch companies, particularly with respect to fossil fuels and climate change. That's where they really are invested, and Trump is completely, he just solicited $1 billion bribe from them and all the other oil people, so we know where they're at.
And they put their money behind Nikki Haley.
Oh, they did.
Early on.
They did for a little while, but
Didn't go anywhere.
it's, and they probably like DeSantis too, but I mean, I think they find Trump personally obnoxious, which he can be.
That's right. Susan?
I actually have two questions. One is, fitting into your book, is where have the Bushes been in all of this? And secondly, whether it's W or Jeb or that generation. And secondly, how does Rudy Giuliani fit into the grifting part?
Well, as I said to Joe before we started, I haven't been able to fit everybody into this narrative because there's just too many of them. And I think Rudy kind of escapes what he deserves in this book, unfortunately. I'll have to get to him later. The Bushes, however, are in here, especially W. And because his administration and his political campaigns represent a part of this pseudo-religious phenomenon. I don't know if you all remember that he ran on what he called then compassionate conservatism. He claimed to be saved by Jesus and all the rest of it. And I go into what that really meant in his administration and his politics, and it's not a pretty story. Now, of course, again, this is someone who is supposedly appalled by Trump, but he hasn't done much. I mean, he's been pretty cowardly about the whole thing. So, and Giuliani is a grifter. I mean, clearly a huge would-be grifter, not very successful at it because he's so unappealing. But yeah, he's certainly tried, and he's also, we know that he's bankrupt now, so he's got problems.
Okay, this gentleman here.
So you said you're not able to fit everyone into this book, and that there are so many more people. Do you see another book or follow-ups to it?
Well, I said, we were talking about this before. I said to Joe, my children, I have 17-year-old twins who've had to spend a lot of time without daddy in the last few years while I was doing this. So they both made me promise. They said, you're not writing any more books. So I didn't totally promise that, but not immediately. I mean, we'll see how this does. If this sells a ton of copies, then maybe I write something else roughly along the same lines. It's not like I left a lot of people out. I mean, there are, a lot of people in there. But there are a few, like Giuliani, who kind of more or less escaped scrutiny here.
Right. Okay, in the back, yes. Yes.
That's you.
Yeah, I wake up every morning, and I don't know why, just appalled by what's going on. And apparently, if some of these people were stopped in the past, like McCarthy and, was it Cohen or?
Roy Cohn, yeah.
Roy Cohen. What was the element that was able to stop them or catch them? And how can we use that element to stop what's going on today? It seems to me like I think about various movements in the past, and it seems as if the people who are being grifted don't understand that. Well, let me just go back and say, I knew a person who was a grifter, and they said the elements of grifting have to do with larceny and sympathy. And in the case of sympathy, you know, it's like you empathize with the person because basically there's something that you want from them. And larceny, I guess larceny is where they want something from you, and sympathy, I can't remember how it works, but this larceny and sympathy. And it seems like in every event, hate is a central character in the grift, or the other, or finding a way to hate the other in some kind of way, like Rwanda. And hate doesn't have to be, people think that hate is black or white, or this race against that race, but over in Russia and Ukraine, it's white on white. And you go look down through history, and through history, all of these grifts have had to do with finding the element that enables them to grift. And it's something that they empathize, people empathize with, and hate is the hugest factor, the dividing factor, the other. And it doesn't have to be color, it could be the girl looks prettier, or this person is wealthier, or this person is smarter. And they find that element, and they are able to use that to divide people, and then they're able, once they divide the people, they can conquer and walk away with the money.
So that is a big theme in my book, that hate and fear are essential elements of this. And that in many ways, one of the ways that they've corrupted conservatism is to make it really exclusively a movement about hate and fear. I mean, you know, Donald Trump's entire campaign in this cycle is about retribution against other people. It has no other meaning except that. You will see that there will be no platform, there's no purpose, there's nothing that, you know, he's thought, well, we'll make America great again, but these are platitudes. There's no actual policy that they're interested in pursuing except more tax cuts, I guess. And really anything else that represents selfishness.
Oh, deporting immigrants.
So,
Yes, they was involved, that's right.
So
And again, that's hate. That's a hate movement.
So I suggest a counter movement. And a lot of times, the reason these things can exist is because people are just either just ignorant of the fact of what's happening to them, or they don't understand how that element works on them, and how what you have been saying today makes it even more clear to me how these grifts took place. And sometimes I think people don't realize that they're being grifted. And I think that if there was an ultra movement that had to do with how people are being grifted, and it becomes a united front against this.
Well, I'm hopeful that I'm going to get to talk about this in various places, and maybe the media will pick up on it. I mean, you know, among the things that I do, you might be surprised to learn, is that I'm a regular commentator on Newsmax TV, which is a far-right TV network. And I'm going to try to get them to talk about, or let me talk about my book on the air. So we'll see what happens with that. That'll be an interesting moment when I tell my producers there that I want to talk about my book.
That's great. Going into the lion's den, I think that's very good.
I do it every week.
That's great. So, as we close, let me once again thank and let us all again extend our warm gratitude to
Thank you, Joe, for a great interview, and thank you, Neil, and everyone at Puffin for sponsoring this. It was a great warm-up for me to go out and try to promote this book in the next few months, and thank you all so much for coming.